The European Union is facing a challenge it has never faced before. With the full-scale invasion of Ukraine taking place just behind its eastern border, the Union has had to relocate its spending, focusing now primarily on defense as well as aid to Ukraine. However, there are many more issues that MEPs will need to work on, like the Green Deal, migration crises, as well as energy, just to name the few. Now, to talk about the challenges that EU MEPs will be faced with, I am joined by Velina Tchakarova, founder of FACE Geopolitical Consultancy. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining me.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So I just mentioned few of the challenges, few issues that new MEPs will have to face, like the Green Deal, migration, energy, trade, EU enlargement. Which of these do you think should be top priority for the new parliament members?
Well, given the exit polls and the expectations how the new European Parliament will look like in terms of representation, the expectation is that the cost of living and, of course, the rising costs in general in the European Union members will be one of the biggest issues that the Parliament will tackle and will deal with. And, of course, a lot of the policies that you mentioned, which are in the portfolio of the European Parliament, starting from the recovery plans, moving to the defense budget, and finally the Green Deal and the agricultural policy. There will be, of course, a function of the way how actually the inflationary influence coming from the ongoing war and from actually the global fragmentation, how this is going to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think that because of the conflict in Ukraine, do you think people will actually go out and vote, especially this part of our region?
Of course, the election for European Parliament is often regarded as a secondary order election. So, unfortunately, still European citizens do not regard this election to be serious enough to go and vote, which is unfortunate, given the impact and the influence that the European Parliament has on other institutions. Let's not forget that the Parliament has influence on the confirmation of all commissioners. It has a role to play when it comes to free trade agreements, when it comes to the budget, including the budget for security and defense, which will grow. So in a sense, foreign policy and security policy issues usually do not lead to more voting, but at the same time, I think that the awareness currently is rising, and hopefully, especially younger population, will take the time to vote in the next few days.
You know, some people say that voting, especially in these elections, it's like a referendum on the party in power in certain countries. Would you agree with that? I mean, what I'm getting at is that people don't really understand what is happening in European Parliament and the and all the institutions that go into it, into European Union. So they just vote for people they know and the policies they know.
Indeed, that is mostly the case. So the parties running as candidates for the European Parliament, they're building powerful blocks within the European Parliament, which are assigned to often to the national preferences of the voters. Currently, the European People's Party is still being ranked as number one according to exit polls. I would be a little bit cautious regarding exit polls, since we saw how wrong exit polls were at several on several occasions, the most recent case being the Indian election. But still, we have these two powerful traditional blocks of the People's Party and Social Democrats. And then we have
unfortunately, here in Poland, we can't go into the details of each party because it's a day before the election. So I just would like to stop you from us discussing certain parties. But when it comes to general issues, like, for example, defense, there isn't the idea that countries should cooperate on defense even closer than they cooperate right now. Now, taking into considerations their own issues, their own interior issues, defense spendings, etc., do you think countries can afford spending more on defense when it comes to the united front?
Absolutely, and actually this is the expectation with the new parliament. In fact, the European Parliament, as I said, plays a role in deciding over the next budget. The new multi-financial framework will be decided during this mandate of European institutions, and the defense budget has been the orphan in the European Union spending so far. So it is absolutely clear that the defense budget will be increased and that the parliament will have to vote on it. So depending on how exactly this new European Parliament will look like in terms of representation, there will be issues, for instance, linked to expectation as to how big this budget should be. But obviously, the European Union will play a bigger role when it comes to supporting Ukraine, also in the field of military aid.
Now, looking back, how would you assess defense and helping Ukraine from the previous years that EU actually passed its test?
Well, we saw the biggest issue, that is that Ukraine hasn't received enough military aid. And of course, it was mostly reliant on the bilateral aid coming from the member states. But for the very first time, we saw also a unique mechanism for providing military aid coming from the European Union. In fact, this mechanism, the peace facility mechanism, was not meant for Ukraine. It was meant for other operations and other, support for other countries, other parts of the world, mostly Africa. And it had to be readjusted just for the sake of helping Ukraine. So here we saw a lot of space for improvement because it's happening too slowly, too inefficiently, and the result is that Ukraine is then struggling to face a new military attacks by Russia. Now, the war, you need to understand, is going to continue beyond 2025, 2026, is here to stay with all the inflationary impact, with the rising costs of living for our European citizens. So in a sense, my expectation is that the European Union will have to play a much more important role, specifically in this portfolio, with new mechanisms and new policies, whether it's going to be about defense-related bonds or, new increased debt for the short term. But obviously, the United States is not going to be the key player anymore, also given the fact that they are facing their own election.
And the United States, I don't think they want to be a key player. They actually stress very much that Europe should take care of their own issues. Now, speaking of, we spoke about defense, but just recently, European Commission has recommended that the EU start accession talks with Ukraine this month. How big of news is this for Ukraine?
Well, it's significant news. Again, the European Parliament has here also a role to play in the enlargement policy. The Commission is in the lead, but the Parliament has to approve. The same goes for all relevant foreign policy decisions, for instance, when it comes to free trade agreements. Ukraine and Moldova are in the lead. That is very important because they will receive a lot of financial help and institutional support in the process of enlargement. Right now, they are within the official track of enlargement, and that is the most important news. Again, depending on the way how the new European Parliament will look like, we may have some Eurosceptic parties which will be more active within the Parliament, and that could be bad news in terms of blocking important foreign policy relations. So similar to the defense budget, here we may see some hurdles in terms of how to move on with this important portfolio of enlargement.
Now, speaking of hurdles, I want to ask you finally about migration. That's also a very controversial issue for Europe, for many of the European countries. Some are, were touched by that crisis more than others. How do you think EU handled, EU Parliament, EU as a general, handled that issue?
Well, obviously, here the big issue is that Europe is facing a rapidly aging population on the one hand. So there is no doubt that managed migration is critically important, as we see that it has a positive impact on countries like the United States. And at the same time, United States are in a similar situation as we are right now in how to tackle this migration, right? So the European member states have different views depending on how impacted they are in the short term by the unmanaged migration and asylum system. But at the same time, the war in Ukraine showed us that we can actually tackle asylum and refugees in a quite efficient way. This will be a big issue. I think that the most controversial will be linked to this portfolio, similarly also to the portfolio of the Green Deal and the portfolio of the green policies. Again, it will be very much linked to the way how the new parliament will look like in terms of structure, since more right-leaning parties and populist parties will be sitting, and they are obviously the parties also which are vehemently against migration of any kind. And I think that the way how we will tackle this issue will also decide our fate, more or less. Let me remind you the speech of Macron, the French president, who said actually that Europe is mortal, and it will be very much decisive how we will take the decisions of today. So migration will be one of these issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for shedding light on these issues and the past, and we'll see what the future will bring. Thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you very much for the invitation.